The Appalachian Mountains are steeped in myth, but few stories are as chilling as those whispered among the locals about the creatures that walk the ridgelines at night. They call them the Hollowed Ones, though some know them by another name, skinwalkers. Jacob was a park ranger stationed deep in the mountains. He had spent years working these trails, guiding tourists and campers, enforcing safety and helping those lost in the dense forest. He knew these woods well, perhaps too well. It had been years since he felt any sense of danger from the wilderness. It had become routine. But that changed one summer, after a series of strange occurrences near a remote campsite called Raven's Ridge. The first reports were simple enough. Hikers claimed to hear animal calls late at night. Nothing unusual, except for the fact that these calls sounded off. The voices of coyotes, owls or elk, but twisted somehow, like they were being mimicked by something that didn't quite understand what it was imitating. Jacob had chalked it up to nerves, or the forest's natural sounds playing tricks on them. That's what he told himself anyway. Then people began disappearing. It started with a pair of campers. They were experienced outdoorsmen, well prepared and seasoned, but they vanished without a trace. A search party was organized, and Jacob, being familiar with the area, was asked to lead. He followed the trail they had marked on their maps, pushing deeper into Raven's Ridge than he'd been in years. The first thing he noticed was the silence. The forest around him was always alive with noise, birds, insects, the rustle of leaves in the wind. But here the woods were dead quiet, no animals, no wind, just an oppressive, eerie stillness. The air felt thicker, heavier, as though the woods themselves were watching. As they pushed further into the dense trees, Jacob found signs of the missing campers. A torn backpack here, a discarded jacket there, but no bodies, no blood, just things left behind, as if the earth had swallowed them whole. Days turned into weeks, and the search was called off. Local authorities concluded that they had either gotten lost or fallen prey to some natural danger, though none could say for sure. Jacob, however, couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more, something unseen that had taken them. Months passed without incident until one night Jacob received a call. A hiker was missing again, this time a lone traveler who had gone off-trail near Raven's Ridge. Jacob hesitated. The memory of the campers still weighed on him, but duty called. He packed his gear, grabbed his rifle, and set off toward the ridge. It was late evening when Jacob arrived, the sun already sinking behind the mountains, casting long shadows through the trees. The trail was faint, barely visible in the dimming light. He followed it for miles, deeper and deeper into the woods. As night fell, the woods around him became a maze of shadow and twisted branches. That's when he heard it. An animal call, faint but distinct, echoing through the trees. It sounded like a coyote, but there was something wrong with it. The pitch was too high, the rhythm unnatural, like a broken record. Jacob stopped in his tracks, shining his flashlight in the direction of the sound. The beam cut through the fog, but there was nothing there, just trees and darkness. He pressed on, his instincts screaming at him to turn back, but he had a job to do. He had to find the missing hiker. The trail grew harder to follow, as if it was vanishing before his eyes, swallowed by the forest. The trees closed in around him, their twisted branches looming overhead like skeletal hands. The air was colder now, biting, and the oppressive silence had returned. Then another sound, a voice this time, faint, distant but unmistakably human. Jacob froze. It was calling for help. He pushed forward, following the voice through the thick underbrush. His flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows as the trees seemed to shift around him. The voice grew louder, closer, but something about it was wrong. It was repeating the same phrase over and over again, a monotone plea for help, like a recording stuck on a loop. His pulse quickened as the realization hit him. The voice was too flat, too emotionless. It didn't sound like a person. It sounded like something pretending to be one. Jacob raised his rifle and scanned the trees, his breath coming in shallow gasps. That's when he saw it, movement in the distance, a shape moving between the trees. At first he thought it was the missing hiker, but as he stepped closer, the figure came into view, and a chill ran down his spine. It was humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its body gaunt, stretched in unnatural proportions. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, clinging to its bones like it was too tight, and its face— Jacob's heart nearly stopped. The thing's face was blank, featureless, like clay half moulded into a human shape. But worse than that was the way it moved. Jerky, stiff, like it was learning how to walk for the first time. Suddenly, the thing turned toward him, its featureless face contorted, twisting into a crude approximation of a human expression, its mouth too wide, its eyes non-existent. Then it spoke, in the same flat, emotionless voice that had called out to him moments ago, "Help me!" Jacob backed away, his heart racing. The creature took a step forward, its movements unnatural, like it was being controlled by invisible strings. The woods seemed to come alive around it, the trees shifting, the ground groaning beneath his feet. Without thinking, Jacob fired a shot. The creature jerked violently but didn't fall. It stood there, staring at him with that grotesque, empty face. Then, in one sudden, fluid motion, it lunged forward with unnatural speed. Jacob turned and ran, adrenaline surging through his veins. The forest twisted around him, the trees closing in as though they were alive, trying to trap him. Behind him he could hear the thing crashing through the underbrush, its voice still calling out in that hollow, mocking tone, "Help me! Help me!" He ran blindly through the woods, branches tearing at his clothes and skin. His lungs burned, his legs screamed in protest, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. He knew if he did, that thing would catch him. Finally, after what felt like hours, Jacob burst through the trees and into a clearing. The moon hung low over the mountains, casting an eerie glow on the land. He collapsed to his knees, panting, trying to catch his breath. The forest behind him was silent. No footsteps, no voices, nothing. It was as if the thing had vanished. But he knew better. He had felt it in the air, the way the woods had shifted, the way the trees had seemed to move on their own. The hollowed ones were real. They wore the faces of the lost, mimicked their voices, and waited in the shadows to lure the unsuspecting. Jacob never returned to Raven's Ridge after that night. The missing hiker was never found, and the stories around the area grew even darker. Some said the land was cursed, others that it belonged to ancient beings who could take the form of anything they desired. But Jacob knew the truth. There was something in those mountains, something old and malevolent, something that watched and waited, and it still did.